Good afternoon. I'm Joanne Barnhart, Executive Director of the Magyar Foundation of North America. The term Magyar refers to the ethnicity primarily associated with Hungarians. The Magyar people have a rich and complex history rooted in the dynamic evolution of Central Europe. Magyar culture is informed by thousands of years of European history, but also has modern roots throughout the world, and particularly in North America today. The foundation is committed to enhancing relations between Hungary and the U.S. by raising the visibility of and promoting Hungarian culture, contributions, and issues of mutual interest. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this forum, the Foundation's 2016 launch event. My sincere thanks to Dean Pete Peterson and Pepperdine University School of Public Policy for the papers that will be presented and discussed today. This collaborative effort was made possible by the support of Pepperdine University and the Ronald Reagan Library and a grant from the Foundation to fund the work of Professors Kaufman and Shevchenko. This effort also marks the beginning of the Foundation's Hungarian Scholar Program. Please welcome Gergely Rajnai, a PhD candidate at Corvinus University of Budapest, who was competitively selected to provide research assistance to the professors. Gergely. The U.S.-Hungarian relationship has a long and rich history. I hope you had the opportunity to view the video the Foundation produced celebrating the contributions of Lajos Kossuth, the father of Hungarian democracy, and his historic 1852 address to a joint session of Congress. He was the second foreign dignitary to do a joint session address, only after Marquis de Lafayette being the first. And he also made had an historic meeting with then Illinois lawyer Abraham Lincoln. If you didn't have a chance to see the video, please take a few minutes to view it when you leave, or you can see it on our website at www.magyarfoundation.com. And now I will turn the program over to Pete Peterson, Dean of Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. Pete.
Thank you, Joanne, and good afternoon. In a letter to his friend and fellow physicist, Robert A. Thornton, Albert Einstein wrote in 1944, quote, "So many people today, and even professional scientists, seem to me like somebody who has seen thousands of trees but has never seen a forest. A knowledge of the historic and philosophical background gives that kind of independence from prejudices of his generation from which most scientists are suffering." Now, if Einstein can cite the importance of understanding historical context when it comes to physics, how much more should we consider such factors when it comes to the very human subject of foreign policy? This is the perspective we take in the preparation of future public leaders at Pepperdine School of Public Policy. It is a perspective drawn from our founding nearly 2 decades ago, when a unique group of leaders and scholars, including James Q. Wilson, Jack Kemp, and Michael Novak, came together to create a new graduate policy program which takes a humanistic liberal arts approach to the subject of public policy, whether at the local, national, or international level. It is why we are so delighted to engage with the Magyar Foundation in the research and writing of the papers we release today. Our professors, Dr. Robert Kaufman and Dr. Alexei Shevchenko, both bring an approach to the subject of the relationship between the United States and Hungary that considers the very human factors of history and culture. This longer-term view of international relations is one shared with the Magyar Foundation, and we are grateful for their support of these important research reports. As the Pepperdine School of Public Policy continues expanding our programs into the nation's capital through the university's new presence at our building at 2011 Pennsylvania Avenue, we look forward to more days like this, highlighting, as our founders would have wanted, the public part of public policy. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Pepperdine's Doxon Professor of Public Policy, Dr. Robert Kaufman, with the first presentation. Dr. Kaufman. Joanne.
Thank you, Dean Peterson, and thank you for coming. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to speak on this subject, which is Ronald Reagan's role in winning the Cold War. It's an important subject, especially for this audience, because unlike his predecessors who accepted the permanence of the Soviet Union's existence, unlike his predecessors who believed that Eastern Europe would remain the Soviet Union's sphere of influence, Ronald Reagan was not only committed to defeating the Soviet Union, ending the evil empire, but he uniquely saw the liberation of Eastern Europe as pivotal to ending the Cold War that dominated the final 45 years of the 20th century. In public relations and popular opinion polls today, Americans rate Ronald Reagan as their favorite president. Credit the American people for better judgment than most academics or commentators in Washington, D.C., who tend to underestimate Ronald Reagan's great accomplishments. Ronald Reagan not only restored American prosperity, but he restored American power, overcame the evil empire, and extended the democratic zone of peace to East Central Europe. As Adam Michnik, the great Polish dissident, put it at the Reagan Library in October of 2014, the end of the Cold War and the liberation of Eastern Europe that Ronald Reagan contributed so mightily to bringing about gave Eastern Europe the chance to be free and human again. Not the guarantee, but the chance. So what should we take away from Reagan's victory in the Cold War in general and for Hungary? First, we have to remember the accomplishment because we're in danger of losing its significance and how it happens. In his farewell address in January of 1989, surveying his great accomplishments, Ronald Reagan took pride, but he warned, if we forget history, if we forget American history, if we forget world history, if we forget the heroes who extended freedom, all that I've accomplished will be lost. And today, there is a threat that it is going to be lost because there is a dangerous revisionism about the Cold War that underestimates the magnitude and the conditionality of the achievement. One version of it goes like this. According to Strobe Talbot, then writing in Time magazine, he later went on to be Under Secretary of State President Clinton, serving primarily in Russian affairs. According to Talbot, we won the Cold War because it need not have been fought. The Soviet Union wasn't that threatening in the first place. Another variation of that argument comes from academics. It goes like this. The real hero of the Cold War's end was not Reagan, but Gorbachev. It was Gorbachev who ended the Cold War. It was Gorbachev who saved Reagan during Reagan's second term from his belligerent self. Gorbachev, not Reagan, therefore deserves the prime credit. We will lose much in terms of honoring past heroes, and we will lose even more, losing the real lessons of the Cold War, if we don't understand that we won the Cold War because we fought it, and that we won the Cold War in its final phase because of the mighty contributions that Ronald Reagan made. Let's start with taking the victory in the Cold War for granted. Sure didn't look that way in the end of the 1970s. The United States was beset by a phenomenon called stagflation. In the midst of a lacerating debate about a controversial war, not Iraq, Vietnam, but Iraq has had the same consequence, there were grave doubts about American power and whether we were in permanent decline. This ran through both parties. Richard Nixon, for example, believed that détente was inevitable because the Soviet Union was a rising power and we were a declining one. During the Ford administration, Henry Kissinger convinced President Ford not to see Alexander Solzhenitsyn at the White House, the great Soviet dissident, lest it offend the Soviet Union and jeopardize détente, which we believed was necessary and inevitable. President Carter carried that defeatist mood. In 1977 at Notre Dame, he boasted proudly that his administration had overcome our inordinate fear of communism. That was certainly news to people behind the Iron Curtain. And in 1978, the Carter administration returned the Holy Crown of Hungary to an illegitimate, repressive Hungarian regime, signifying the Carter administration's belief in the legitimacy and the permanence of the Soviet Union's domination of Eastern Europe, extinguishing its freedom. Ronald Reagan accepted none of that. Ronald Reagan defied the conventional wisdom. He believed that our best days were ahead of us rather than behind us. If we restored American power, reinvigorated freedom, and waged the Cold War with vigilance and prudence, not just to tolerate the Soviet Union, but to bring down a Soviet regime that had killed millions and tyrannized tens of millions more. He succeeded by adopting a comprehensive policy of pressure on the Soviet Union, the Reagan military buildup, economic sanctions, and not least, public diplomacy that called the Soviet Union what it was, an evil empire. For my second book, which was a biography of Scoop Jackson, a hawkish hero of the Cold War, I had the privilege of interviewing Natan Sharansky in Israel. And I asked Sharansky, and he's recounted it in his book, when did you know that the Cold War was going to be won? And Sharansky, no shrinking violet, emphatically said, I know the exact moment. I was in my prison cell. It was March 9th, 1983. I had a bad meal, and then somebody tapped to me in Morse code what Ronald Reagan said to the Council of Evangelicals in Florida, in Orlando. And what Reagan said, Sharansky said, was that the Soviet Union was an evil empire that would lie, cheat, and steal to achieve its ultimate objective of world domination. I asked Sharansky, well, what made you so optimistic because of that the Cold War would be won? And Sharansky replied, finally, somebody understands what the Soviet Union is about and knows what to do to free Eastern Europe and ultimately the Soviet Union from the ravages of communist tyranny. So Reagan used military pressure, public diplomacy, economic sanctions, and the restoration of American power to reverse what previous administrations made permanent. And this all came together in the foundational Reagan document outlining his Cold War strategy, National Security Directive number 75, which he signed on January 3rd, 1983, which made bringing down the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe a primary goal of American foreign policy for the first time since NSC 68 under the Truman administration, issued in January of 1950. According to Reagan, the Cold War could not be won and should not be won until Eastern Europe in general and Hungary in particular was free of Soviet domination. Now, what about the argument that Reagan changed because of Gorbachev? Reagan recognized, sooner than his conservative supporters, sooner really than anybody other than Margaret Thatcher, that Gorbachev was indeed a different type of leader. Nevertheless, Reagan changed his tactics, but not his basic strategy. The American military buildup continued. He insisted on SDI. The Cold War ended not on Gorbachev's terms, but Reagan's. Consider this. Gorbachev thought he was saving communism and miscalculated. Reagan knew that he was bringing it down, and he had dedicated his entire political life to achieving that accomplishment. Reagan's hardline policies that yielded such success, including the Soviet Union eliminating an entire category of nuclear weapons, contrasted starkly with the policies of the 1970s that preached conciliation and accepted the permanence of the Soviet regime. So Ronald Reagan stands as a hero of the Cold War, the hero who liberated Eastern Europe, not because he changed his mind, but because he remained faithful to the principles that animated his entry and perseverance in political life. His ferocious antipathy to totalitarianism of any variety, first Nazi totalitarianism that brought Reagan into politics in the first place as an early interventionist in World War II, and then after World War II with his experience with communists in the Screen Actors Guild, extending his abhorrence to totalitarianism to the Soviet Union and what he considered the existential threat that it represented, which the West had to resist with all its might. Poring through Reagan's speeches, and I've done a lot of Reagan research, and his diaries, there aren't many specific references to Hungary, but paradoxically, Hungary was very important to Ronald Reagan. One, his diaries indicate that Reagan considered the Soviet Union's suppression of Hungarian freedom fighters in 1956 the emblematic example of what the evil empire was about, why it needed to be resisted, and why it needed to be reversed. In the Cold War, there are many heroes who deserve acclaim, including the Hungarian freedom fighters, including the brave dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, including the hawks in Congress and the American people who, for more than 40 years, faithfully supported the United States through adversity of bearing the burden and paying the price of defending and extending freedom and defending us from the Soviet Empire. Nevertheless, with all that granted, Ronald Reagan deserves unique credit for understanding and implementing a vigilant grand strategy to bring the Soviet Union down at a propitious moment. He not only had the vision, but the political skills to mobilize the American people successfully to conclude that endeavor. The world is vastly better off now. Eastern Europe is vastly better off now. Hungary, for all of its contemporary issues, is vastly better off now that the Cold War has been won and that the scourge of the 20th century, totalitarianism of the left and right, has been defeated. But before we celebrate with triumphalism, and we should celebrate that victory for the West in general and for Hungary in particular, here's a warning that Ronald Reagan gave in his farewell address. Every generation has to fight for freedom. It takes generations to win your freedom. If you forget how you won your freedom and you take that freedom for granted, you can lose that freedom in a generation. Ronald Reagan did his job. The issue today in the Western world, in East Central Europe, and the world in general is, will we do our job to defend and extend the zone of democratic peace, as well as Ronald Reagan did his job. Let us hope so, because if we don't, and freedom recedes, and we forget how we won the Cold War and the lessons to be derived that apply to contemporary policy, if we forget all of that, life will, in many places, perhaps even in East Central Europe, become, as Thomas Hobbes famously put it, nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. So let us celebrate Reagan. Let us celebrate the Hungarian freedom fighters. Let us celebrate the great achievement, but let's not forget how we won it, what it means, and the implications of those lessons for this generation and those beyond who depend on us fulfilling our job to defend freedom, as Reagan so splendidly fulfilled his. Thank you for your forbearance.
Thanks, Bob. It has become fashionable in pseudo-academic circles to believe that the world is flat, that we are citizens of the world, and really there's not much of a difference between California and here, much less the United States and other countries. Yet as we look around the world stage, we see what can only be called the revenge of history. The search for identity, an identity that is founded in history and in culture. The field of social psychology has entered into this discussion in some new and I think fascinating ways. The ideas of groups and how they form, how they interact with their own history, how they understand their history and their relationships with other countries is a field that is being covered in new ways. And that's why I'm so excited to introduce another professor from the School of Public Policy, Alexei Sevchenko, who will analyze more current relationships between the United States and Hungary through the field of social interest theory. Professor Sevchenko.
Thanks, Pete. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My paper is looking at contemporary relationship between Hungary and the West. I'm starting with the obvious puzzle. If you're following recent developments, the puzzle, of course, is that the relationship between Hungary and the West has been beset by a number of disagreements over some of the prominent issues, including political reforms in Hungary, including refugee crisis, including policy towards Russia. If you're following events, if you looked at the news yesterday, for example, Hungary will be the first country to hold a referendum on the European Union's plans to create a quota system for migrants from mandatory quota system for migrants coming from Middle East. And this is, of course, the initiative which was rejected by Hungary's government, and now is going to be the first referendum. Some analysts call the period since 2010, since the Fidesz party coming back to power in Hungary, the most debated period of Hungarian foreign policy in the past quarter century. It's a puzzle because Hungary has been acknowledged widely as the ideal reform country since late 1980s. It's a steadfast follower of the West. It was one of the trailblazers in transitions to markets and economy. So the question is, why did a quarter century after this jubilation over Hungary's return to Europe, Hungary emerges as the first country to start distancing itself from, post-1989 liberal consensus, as it's usually called? I tried to make sense of recent developments in Hungary's relationship with the West by looking at Hungarian post-Cold War identity formation. And I rely, as Dean Peterson mentioned, on some insights from social identity theory in social psychology, which looks at social groups and which argues that they try to achieve positive distinctiveness, and they rely on certain identity management strategies to enhance their relative position, and I adapt it to international politics. So let me explain how my theoretical framework works, because it's important for the paper. So basically, the social identity theory identifies three techniques which social groups can use to enhance their relative standing, right? Which they can use to pursue distinctive identity. One way is the so-called strategy of social mobility, when you try to imitate more advanced elite groups. Another strategy is social competition, when you try to displace, when you try to rival the high-ranked group. And then there's a third one. You find a new arena in which to be superior, and this is called the social creativity strategy. My basic argument, and I apply those insights to foreign policy, to international relations. My basic argument is that one way to conceptualize post-2010 developments in Hungarian domestic and foreign policy is to look at it as an attempt of a redefinition of identity. Hungary moves away from the strategy of emulation, social mobility, which was pursued since '89, and it embraces the strategy of social creativity. My paper looks at the major factors which lead to this change in identity management strategy. Then it looks at some of the ingredients of social creativity strategy. All right. So let me start a little bit with looking at post-1989 developments in Hungary. Clearly, this is a search. The strategy which is pursued at the time is a strategy of social mobility. Hungary tries to integrate into the West. Hungary tries to conform to the criteria for membership in the key Western institutions. This is the overarching goal after the end of the communist rule. If you look at foreign policy, Hungary positions itself as a staunch great Atlanticist. It advocates close cooperation with the United States on security, economic, and political matters. It's an ideal reform country, in other terms. It's a follower of the West on most of the issues. However, several factors change this strategy. One of them is the rise of popular discontent over the result of post-1990 transition to democracy, because it becomes associated with a lot of social problems, mass unemployment, rising social inequality. Global financial crisis exaggerates those problems. The Hungarian government's irresponsible economic policy brings the country to a very serious financial situation by 2009. If you look at the Pew Research Center polls, which were taken, I believe, in the fall of 2009, you will see some pretty staggering figures. 72% of Hungarians surveyed believe that they're better off economically under socialism. So you definitely have this disillusionment with the developmental model pursued after 1990. And this disillusionment is not unique to Hungary, let me emphasize this. If you look at somebody like Fukuyama, right, the person who authored The End of History, if you look at Fukuyama writing 25 years after the end of history, he himself used the global performance of democracy as disappointing. Right? He talks about the crisis in governance. He talks about poor governing capacity of a lot of new democratic transitions. He talked about delegitimation of democracy as a product of this growing dissatisfaction. So that's one factor which sort of slowed down the social mobility route. Another factor was geopolitical. Hungary, of course, is dependent on Russia historically for natural gas imports. And that's why Hungary's foreign policy from the beginning of post-communist transition was influenced by Russian growing assertiveness in the former Soviet space and by Russian energy policy in Europe. And of course, Hungary had to accommodate Russia on many issues, and this made Hungary vulnerable to Russia's political pressure, and it sort of undermined a lot of goals of Hungarian foreign policy since early 1990s. Another factor responsible for increasing questioning of social mobility strategy and distancing from social mobility strategy was Euroscepticism. As you all know, Euro crisis and the growing perceptions of the European Union inability to engage in efficient decision-making to restore economic growth in Europe led to a pretty serious bout of Euroscepticism across Europe. You also have Great Recession of 2008-2009, which sort of which undermines the legitimacy of the global status hierarchy, legitimacy of the United States global financial leadership, legitimacy of liberal capitalist model. You also have a widespread perception that the United States is a declining power circulating across Europe since 2008-2009, and not just Europe, right, globally. Right. Another factor which plays into those growing doubts about social mobility is the Obama administration efforts to reset relationship with Russia. It was inaugurated in February 2009, and it's a problem for most of Eastern European states because reset, and I don't have much time to talk about the details, but reset is basically not accompanied by strategic reassurance of Eastern European partners. This is a common complaint across Europe. For Budapest, this is perceived as a major departure from United States policy in Eastern Europe since the collapse of the Soviet bloc. It fuels concerns about the ability of transatlantic alliance to balance out Russia's growing geopolitical ambitions. And I'll give you a quote from one of the works that I cite. Because of that, Hungary reaches a conclusion that it could not rely fully on its most important strategic allies, the United States and NATO. Another factor in growing doubts about social mobility. So again, if you apply the logic of social identity theory, what you see evolving since 2010 is the Orban's coalition attempt to redefine Hungary's international identity, moving away from social mobility to what social identity theory would call a social creativity, right? You have to come up with your own distinctive version of international identity. If you look at the ingredients of this international identity, you definitely see the primacy of national sovereignty. You definitely see the idea of a strong and efficient state. You definitely see an emphasis on national pride and dignity, affirmation of Christian values, cultural specificity. You see a very strong argument that liberal multiculturalism and mass immigration is not the road for Hungary because it will threaten ethnic balkanization. You definitely see the appeal to the feelings of victimhood and the desire for resurrection of Hungarian greatness. And in my paper, I talk about, I have a discussion of Hungary's painful history of relationship with the West, and there's plenty of sources for the feelings of victimhood. Right. If you look at the first vote of the Fidesz-controlled parliament, not surprisingly, it's a law which establishes the Day of National Unity to be observed on June 4th. And of course, this is the day of the signing of the Treaty of Trianon, which halved, right, which dramatically reduced the size of the Hungarian territory and the size of its population. And this is the first official commemoration of this treaty since the end of World War II. Right. The commemoration of Trianon is supposed to bring together all Hungarians, including Hungarians living abroad. Right. Now, for the first time in nearly a century, they have the right to obtain Hungarian citizenship and vote in Hungarian elections. So definitely one of those messages emerging in this new national identity, in the new national narrative, is that Hungary is not a culprit of World War II, nor its loser. Right? It's the innocent victim of foreign great powers. This is a very important, important part of this new identity. You also see a lot of effort in promoting the historical narrative depicting Hungary as a Christian force which saves Europe from Muslim invaders. Right? And you have plenty of historical illustrations here, of course, as well. The government, Orban government, also tries to rethink the relationship between integration with Europe, European integration, and national sovereignty. Hungary is no longer viewing itself as a compliant student of the Western educators. It should be genuinely sovereign, coming back to the title of my paper, which is too long. I'm sorry for that. All the good titles were taken. Right? My first idea, of course, was the Hungry Games, but was taken by the former ambassador who published an article. In any case, no longer a student, no longer a compliant student, Hungary rejects demands for austerity measures as a condition for a bailout from IMF, European Union, World Bank. It implements what is usually referred to as unorthodox measures designed to increase revenue through additional taxes on banks and nationalization of privatized segments of the pension system. Right, so you have this emerging argument that domestic politics and foreign policy should be driven by national interests, should be driven by pragmatism, not by abstract values and norms. Right, and of course you have the electoral revolution since 2010, 2/3 majority received in the 2010 parliamentary elections, which empowers the Orban's coalition to introduce a range of legislative measures and constitutional changes designed to reform Hungarian political system more in the direction of majoritarian democracy. Why? Because this is the foundation of strong and efficient state. This is the foundation for state capacity, which the coalition talks about since they came to power in 2010. You all heard about July 2014 speech delivered to ethnic Hungarians in Romania. You probably heard about February 2015 State of the Nation address by Prime Minister Orban, where he talks very frankly about the decline of the liberal Western model of political and economic development, underscored by 2008 financial crisis, where he talks about the goal of creating an efficient state capable of making nations successful, globally competitive, right? Where he proclaims determination to not to be like the rest of Europe, which, quote, continues to huddle behind the modes of political correctness. Right. Hungary decided, quote, to let go of the dogma of political correctness. So you definitely have this shift in the past 4 to 5 years, shift from social mobility towards social creativity predicted by social identity theory. This is very well reflected in the Eastern opening policy pursued currently by the government, which I describe in my paper. Now, I know I'm running out of time, so two more minutes. How about the Western reaction to this redefinition of social creativity? Well, if you look at social identity theory, and it's well tested, right? It talks about social groups. Of course, I adapt it to international politics, but in terms of social groups, it's very well tested and it's very rich in terms of data. SIT predicts that social creativity would not be rewarded by the higher status group if this higher status group is uncertain about its standing. Right, so this is what plays out currently, I think. Challenges to the legitimacy of the Western liberal model, challenges to the legitimacy of the European Union standards are viewed with a lot of suspicion by the European Union and by the US currently, and I think this makes them less likely to recognize and validate Hungary's efforts at redefinition of identity, and that explains a lot of recent controversies. Right. However, despite the tensions in the relationship with the West, Hungary's efforts to redefine its identity found support among other European members. And here you have a very interesting dynamic of emulating Hungary. If you look at the recent events, Orban has been referred to as the most influential European leader after Angela Merkel. If you look at Poland, which is another poster child of social mobility after 1989, Poland has recently alarmed the West by its willingness to challenge some of the liberal democratic norms and defy the European Union. If you look at the leader of the Law and Justice Party, who came to power in Poland in the fall of 2015. He is a staunch admirer of Orban, and he emulates some of the Hungarian political reforms. If you look at Hungary's tough anti-immigration stance, it has unified and invigorated the Visegrad Group, who now challenges the United States, the EU migration policy. So you can make an argument that some of the aspects of Hungary's social creativity are quickly becoming the mainstream of the European politics. Once again, going to the title of my paper, From a Follower to a Trendsetter. Right? In the atmosphere since November 2015 Paris terrorist attacks, in the atmosphere of the continuing refugee crisis, Germany's approach to immigration, the welcome culture approach, which you probably read about, is challenged. And I'm quoting somewhere in my paper The Economist, who cannot be accused of sympathizing with the actions of the Hungarian government most of the time, saying that after the trauma and after the chaos, referring to refugee problems, of the past 6 months, Hungary feels vindicated, and Germany looks increasingly isolated. Germany had tried to lead Europe, but others will not follow. So basically, Hungary, a loyal disciple of the West a quarter century ago, has now become a trendsetter in challenging the fundamentals of Western political correctness. What are the implications? Well, I think one of the conclusions which we can make is that Hungary's creative redefinition of its identity, its departure from social mobility, from emulation, validates a lot of recent doubts about the narrative which we see entrenched in the past 25 years. The narrative about the irresistible attraction of the liberal world order to transitional societies. The skeptics of this narrative, the critics of this narrative, has long pointed out that liberal order never attained the breadth or depth expected by the West after the Cold War. Right? And Hungary is a proof of this. It was never, there's all kinds of questions about the effectiveness and legitimacy of this liberal order. Another conclusion which I make in my paper is that the relationship between Hungary and the European Union and the US reminds us, especially those who study foreign policy, study international relations, that the usual distinction between the so-called bandwagoning, accommodation, or balancing in international relations fails to capture important differences in support or opposition to the dominant power's foreign policy. Right? Conventional IR theory talks about jumping on the bandwagon of the stronger state or your ally, or balancing. Right? You're trying to resist the state. Well, there's something else. Smaller allies, smaller clients will not invariably act consistently with the preference of their more powerful partners because they need to maintain distinctive foreign policy identity. Right. Because of this, the existing Western strategies of engagement, existing policies of institutional integration should be supplemented by policies and incentives which are very sensitive to the deeply embedded desire for positive distinctiveness, deeply embedded desire for respect and recognition. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shevchenko, for your provocative presentation. My thanks also to Professor Kaufman for the important perspective he provided on the Cold War era, and to you, Dean Peterson. Now I'd like to introduce Congressman Connie Mack, our moderator for the question and answer discussion. Congressman Mack served the 14th District of Florida in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2005 to 2013. During his tenure in the House, he served on the Foreign Affairs Committee and is chairman of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere. Congressman Mack.
Thank you very much. And first of all, congratulations to Pepperdine and the professors on your great work. And I believe that just the discussion today does bear out further questions and trying to dig into some of the conclusions from the theory side and also from Ronald Reagan and what he meant to the Cold War and to where Hungary is today. So it's my honor to moderate questions for our two professors. So maybe if we could have the professors come up. And then if you have a question, just raise your hand. We have a mic. Please tell us, give us your name and who you represent or where you work, and then we'll be happy to get this question answered going. And I promise the dessert's already been served, so you know where we are in this program. And I promise that this won't go on too long. But does anybody have a question that they would like to ask? Way over here, Candace.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. John Gizzi with Newsmax. And I actually have a question for each of the professors, if that's all right. Thank you. For Professor Kaufman, you talked about the Cold War, and you did mention the Hungarian freedom fighters of 1956. Are their role in Hungarian history acknowledged to this day, and particularly American Hungarians, people who'd come to this country who were advocating that the U.S. take action, Zsa Gabor, Béla Lugosi, and Ilona Massey, all were very strong advocates and denounced what happened afterward. And very simply, my question to Professor Shevchenko is, while many journalists in this country are trying to keep an open mind on the return of Mr. Orban to power, it is difficult sometimes when one reads reports about the press and the new tax on publications that comes out, and one feels increasingly a crackdown on freedom of the press. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
On the issue of 1956, are Hungarian freedom fighters heroes? Yes. Is that sufficiently acknowledged here and in Hungary? No. Will the controversy about 1956 go away? No, because there's a legitimate debate about what the United States prudently could have done in 1956, running a risk when the Soviet Union sent tanks in October of 1956. And let me give you Ronald Reagan as an example. I think Reagan struck a prudential balance in 1981, 1982, when at Soviet instigation, General Jaruzelski suppressed the Solidarity movement. We didn't send troops in, but we did support Solidarity and denied the legitimacy of the behavior and denied the legitimacy of Soviet occupation. And ultimately, the combined pressure that Reagan generated, including delegitimizing the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe, led to its collapse. So while I think reasonable people can disagree about the specifics of the reaction to 1956, I think honorable and informed people realized that those Hungarian freedom fighters were not only just fighting for our freedom, they were fighting for theirs and everybody's.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'm not saying that every aspect of this distinctive identity would be necessarily pleasing to the foreign eye, to the Western eye, and some of those concerns have been voiced. Some of the most controversial points of the media law, to the best of my knowledge, were amended according to the recommendations made by the Council of Europe. So some of the elements of what I call social creativity can and should be renegotiated. Right? It's an important process, and Hungarian civil society makes a big difference in this.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Like I said, the dessert's already on the table, so you don't have to worry about, Yes, sir.
What is the role of religion in Hungary today, politically as well as religiously?
what is the role of religion in Hungary? Does one of the is that something that
I think it's an important part, right? I think it's an important ingredient of this emerging identity. The argument that Hungary should be guided by Christian values, right? The argument about historical pride based in the religion. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's a big it's a big part of what's going on. Yes.
very good over here?
Before we get to that question, there's a danger of looking at Hungary just internally without realizing the interplay between external and internal conditions. Democracy is fragile, particularly fledgling democracies. In the period between World War I and World War II, when the perception in Eastern Europe was that French power withdrew as a guarantor, that had a tremendously negative effect on the fragile democracies that had emerged in the region in the aftermath of World War I. When there is a perception, as Professor Shevchenko put it, for good or ill, of a power vacuum generated by doubts about the United States, don't be surprised that that will have similar effects on the internal politics of places like Hungary and Poland, because it's very difficult to take the risks that democracies, particularly fledgling ones, require if they feel externally under siege and insecure. Think of our own history when the greatest stresses to civil liberties from the 1790s on have occurred when we feel we're under foreign threat. The Alien and Sedition Acts, the McCarthy period, Japanese internment, the Patriot Act. So I don't think one should neglect the interplay between the perception of the external and the dynamics of the internal conditions. Power vacuums usually create great stress on free institutions.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have another question over here.
I'm Borko from Bannister Public Affairs. I have two questions. First is if you can address more the issue of war in Ukraine, which is Hungarian border practically, and how does it reflect the relations with Russia and aside from the migrants crisis, which is currently probably the biggest topic. And the second question is also with regards to 1989 events in Hungary, how did George H.W. Bush's administration handle the whole events that took place at that time? Thank you.
All right, let me take the war with Ukraine issue. I talked about the Eastern opening policy, which the current government embraced. So you have to look at, you have to evaluate Hungarian response to Ukrainian crisis in the framework of this policy. When the government came to power in 2010, the initial top priority was to re-emphasize relationship with the United States. And this was on top of the agenda. If you look at the first trips by Foreign Minister Martoni, his first trip was to Washington, where he talked about transatlantic alliance. The problem, well, I talked about the problems. The problems came with sort of fears that the reset would mean less commitment on behalf of the United States to Eastern European partnerships, and this is what really led to the whole idea of Eastern opening, basically an attempt to balance relationship with the West with close relationships with Russia and the Asia Pacific. Orban used to be one of the harshest critics of Russia in Eastern Europe, probably number one, right? He, of all the people, right, of all the politicians, he expanded bilateral ties with Russia. He encouraged Russia to invest in Hungarian economy. He pursued very profitable deals with Moscow, while avoiding strategic commitments, while preserving security ties with NATO and the benefits of the European Union membership. So Eastern Partnership or Eastern opening, right, is a fragile balancing act. Now you have the crisis. The crisis over Ukraine and Crimea in the past several years, and of course this creates a lot of challenges to Eastern opening. I think the balancing act continues. Right, this is the trick to keep it going because it fits in Orban's opinion, Hungary's national interests. If you look at Hungary's record, Hungary cooperates on economic sanctions, albeit reluctantly. Right, Orban said Europe shot itself in the leg by introducing the sanctions. At the same time, it does its best not to alienate Moscow politically. Hungary is not part of this conflict. This is the another statement from March 2014. Orban talked about more autonomy for the Ukrainian region, which used to be part of Hungary. And this generated some controversy because it was interpreted as supporting the Russian government's accusations of discrimination against national minorities by the new Ukrainian authorities. Right, so I would say the crisis complicates this policy, but it continues. It becomes harder to preserve this fragile balance. But that's what they try to do.
On your question about George Herbert Walker Bush, let me use a hockey analogy. Reagan gets the goal of winning the Cold War, and George Herbert Walker Bush gets a major assist. George Herbert Walker Bush did a brilliant job in the final phase of the Cold War, navigating the reuniting of Germany within NATO, reassuring the French and the British and other skeptics and much of Europe. He played that endgame, I think, deftly and prudently, although you can criticize him, and I did, for excessive deference to Gorbachev at one point, what William Safire dubbed the infamous Chicken Kiev speech about keeping the Soviet Union together. I think overall, if you assess the record, George Herbert Walker Bush wasn't a visionary by his own description, but he did faithfully conclude and deftly conclude the final phases of the Cold War, and he deserves tremendous credit in particular for how he navigated the dangerous shoals of achieving a united Germany within NATO, which really signified a Western victory in the Cold War when you considered how it started and the stakes involved.
Thank you. And this will be the last question. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask both professors, how would you predict going forward the future relationship between the United States and Hungary? And I know that probably depends on the presidential election here, but what insights would you have?
Well, I have a forthcoming book coming out on Obama's foreign policy that I'm not supposed to talk about here because that would be too controversial. So I won't do that. I just did a Richard Nixon. What I will say is that the robustness of democracy in Eastern Europe depends vitally on the robustness and credibility of American power. The more the perception is that that power is in decline irretrievably, the more difficult things will become in Eastern Europe in general, and probably Hungary in particular. So I look at America's robustness as an international player and the willingness to remain, as Ronald Reagan wanted it to be, the exceptional nation with exceptional responsibilities. On that issue will hinge the freedom of much of the world, including Eastern Europe, including Hungary.
Anything else to add?
My answer would be, once again, I would go back to my theory, which is derived from social identity theory and social psychology. The prediction there is that social creativity policy, right, the attempt to come up with this distinctive identity, requires the approbation of the dominant group, right? It has to be recognized. What happens if it's not recognized? Well, bad things happen because this shows, failure to recognize those efforts, rejection of those efforts to redefine identity, shows disrespect, shows sort of unwillingness to give respect. It's a big injury to dignity and prestige, and it's likely to provoke resentment. right? It's likely to lead to spoiler behavior. And that's sort of one of my messages in my paper. It has to be, this redefinition of identity has to be negotiated. It has to be welcomed also. Otherwise, you're going to get a spoiler behavior, and I think that's the problem. That's the danger. In the near term, in the relationship between the United States and some of the Eastern European countries, maybe not just Eastern European countries. Dr. Kaufman referred to Strobe Talbot's career, and he was consulting Clinton administration on Russia, and he has an interesting book of memoirs about 1990s dealing with Russia, and he tells the story in the early 1990s before, well, as you remember, when the relationship with Moscow were pretty cordial, the attitude of American policymakers in Russia was, you have to eat your spinach, and you have to enjoy it. Well, guess what happened by 2000? They stopped eating their spinach, they stopped pretending they enjoyed it, and they started to push for more independence and more distinctiveness, and the next stage you're observing now. This is, I don't know what you call it, spoiler behavior, or it's a social competition in my framework, or something worse than that. So that's my fear. That's sort of my cautionary tale about respect for distinctiveness and dignity.
Thank you both to the professors and for your work. Thank you to Pepperdine. Also want to thank the Magyar Foundation. I know there was a lot of hard work put into this, so thank you very much for all of you who worked so hard to make this happen. And since I'm a recovering politician, I would say that I would add to this discussion that our foreign policy matters, and the actions of other countries don't necessarily happen because that's the way a leadership group wants to take it. Sometimes it happens because of either the strength or weakness, as the professor talked about, of who is the dominant force. And so if we want to continue to do what Ronald Reagan said, which is that every generation of Americans has to stand up and fight for our freedoms, then we have to continue to make sure that the idea of freedom is not only welcome, but is supported all throughout the world, and in this case, Eastern Europe and Hungary. Thank you all very much.